I was 73 when a younger woman tried to erase me from my own doorway. "Get out of here, you useless old hag!" she shrieked, her face twisted with a fury I'd never seen in my quiet neighborhood. Her name was Jennifer, and for months she had paced through the rooms of the brick house on Alder Lane as if she owned sunlight and air. She didn't. The deed lived in my filing cabinet beside birth certificates and a pressed wedding rose. It had lived there since my husband died, since I learned how to breathe alone, pay bills alone, and hold a shaky world together with labeled folders and faith. Behind Jennifer stood my son Richard, 35, freshly shaved, optimistic, when the wind blew his way, desolate when it didn't. He had tried businesses that collapsed like card houses, and each time I swept up after the fall. When he faced eviction during his most recent disaster, I asked my tenants to vacate the Alder Lane property, handed him the keys, and told him to make a home. I never said the words that would have sounded like a spell to him. It's legally mine. We even kept a joint account, a reserve from the life insurance his father left us, meant to soothe true emergencies, not whims. That afternoon, when Jennifer slapped my phone to the floor and told me I would never set foot in her house again, I felt something harden and clarify inside me. I walked out humiliated, but the humiliation cooled into something steadier as I drove resolve. The woman had no idea who she was speaking to. I had balanced grief and mortgage notes, repainted baseboards in the summer heat, and negotiated with roofers who called me dear until I produced precise estimates and an iron stare. I had raised a boy alone, and though I had coddled him longer than I should have, my spine had never forgotten how to stand. Back home, I set my purse on the entry table and sat down carefully, letting the quiet settle like snow. Memory wandered to the first time I met Jennifer Richards' breathless call, his insistence that I meet someone special, the restaurant where the napkins were heavy and the lighting soft. My son had looked like a promise that night, haircut, clean suit pressed hope alive in his eyes. Jennifer arrived in a cloud of perfume and charm. I almost believed the sparkle. Almost. There was a tremor in her smile, a slip when I asked, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" She laughed and said she'd modeled in commercials. I felt unease curl behind my ribs. After that dinner, changes arrived quickly, as if she had pressed some hidden lever in my son's life. He sold the car his father left him, his last tender tether. To a steadier man, muttering about investing in a digital venture, Jennifer assured him was poised to explode. He grinned at screens late into the night. He stopped calling me just to say he'd eaten lunch. My questions became irritations, my warnings static. I told myself I was old-fashioned. I told myself love sometimes inspires transformation. I told myself many things because mothers are the world's most reliable storytellers when they need hope. The morning after she cast me out, I put on the navy blazer, I saved for banks and funerals, and drove to the branch on Maple Street. I placed my identification on the counter with both hands steady. "I need to close a joint account," I said, and when the clerk blinked at me, I added immediately. 2 hours later, I walked out with every cent transferred to an account in my name and a stamped letter confirming the change. Then I climbed one flight of stairs to the mortgage department, laid the property deed for Alder Lane on a desk, and commenced an eviction process I never imagined I would file against my own child. Grief tugged at my sleeve, but I shook it off and kept signing. When my phone lit up with Richard's name, 17 calls in a row, I watched it ring until the sound became part of the room. "On the 18th, I answered. His voice broke at once. He begged. He sputtered about bills and opportunities and timing. I listened, and then I spoke like the Margaret who had kept widowed winters from swallowing us both. The money existed for security, not speculation. The house stood on a deed with my name. 30 days was both generous and final. I should have wept after that call. Instead, I brewed tea, opened my laptop, and followed the thread of unease I'd felt since the restaurant. The sensation that Jennifer's face was not new to me. I searched her first name with the city, then with consultant, then with startup, then with scam. Ashamed of the word even as I typed it. I scrolled police advisories, neighborhood posts, old articles tucked behind local paywalls I had never noticed. The afternoon blurred into evening. At some point I realized the tea had gone cold. Outside porch lights flicked on across the street like small stars choosing to appear. I kept digging. A grainy photo slid into view, a profile shot with different hair and a different name, Jessica, but the same unmistakable eyes. An accompanying headline tightened my chest. A man in his 40s had lost his life savings to a romance swindler who promised a business future and delivered an emptied present. I clicked and read again, tracking the pattern across 3 states and multiple aliases like a map of storm damage after a tornado. By the time midnight approached, I had printed everything: articles, warnings, photos, each page cooled under the weight of a paperclip. I added copies of our bank statements that showed the withdrawals I hadn't made, highlighted the transfers a mother notices, even when a son insists she shouldn't look, and tucked it all into a clean manila folder with a single word written on the tab in block letters: evidence. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. The woman who stared back was older than she wanted to be and stronger than she ever planned. "You picked the wrong mother," I told the quiet room, and the room did not argue. The following morning, I carried the folder into the police station, as if it were a shield. Officer Reynolds, a man whose gray mustache had likely listened to hundreds of stories, flipped through my neatly arranged evidence with eyebrows that rose higher at each page. When I finished explaining Jennifer's other names and her pattern, his nod was deliberate. "You've done excellent detective work, Mrs. Watson," he said, and the words, instead of flattering me, made me ache. I had never wanted to be a detective. I had only wanted a son safe from wolves who dressed as companions. He promised to alert the fraud division to flag Richard's name at airports and to file a report that would build a case. I left the station lighter, though the weight of betrayal clung to my shoulders. The phone rang before I had even started my car. The caller ID showed no number, only unknown. I answered, half expecting a scammer's recorded voice. Instead came the faint, cracked whisper of my son. "Mom, I need help." I nearly dropped the phone. He said he was at an airport hotel. His words jumbled, the sound of airplanes muffling his sentences. Jennifer had taken his wallet, his identification, his emergency cash. She had promised coffee, then vanished. His voice broke on the admission. I told him to stay put, to wait in the lobby, to do nothing until I arrived. As I drove, I called Officer Reynolds again, then clutched the wheel, as if my grip could anchor Richard to safety until I reached him. At the hotel, I found him in a corner chair near the vending machines. Eyes, red shoulders, hunched like a boy waiting for detention. He looked up when I called his name, and for the first time in years, I saw the child I had raised instead of the man-child I had enabled. He confessed through clenched teeth that Jennifer had drained his credit cards, convinced him to hand over his father's watch, and left him stripped of dignity. "You were right," he whispered, his eyes avoiding mine. I should have listened. I resisted the urge to gather him in my arms. Instead, I sat across from him, steady, because sometimes a mother's strength is the chair that does not collapse under the weight of her son's shame. For 3 hours we filed reports, canceled cards, flagged stolen identification. Detective Martinez from the fraud division joined us, his tone grim but appreciative of the detailed folder I handed over. "She's not new to us," he admitted. "Your documentation fills in crucial gaps." Richard described Jennifer's tactics, her promises of quick investments, her subtle isolation techniques that made him see his mother as an obstacle. Each word carved guilt into his face, but I let him speak. Truth aired is less poisonous than truth buried. That night, I sat on my porch while he slept in my guest room listening to crickets and distant traffic. For the first time in a long while, I prayed not for rescue, but for transformation. I prayed my son would learn to stand without leaning on lies. Days later, a neighbor informed me that Richard and Jennifer had cleared the Alder Lane house in the dead of night. Vanished. The news no longer sent me spiraling. I had already severed the financial ties and filed the eviction. But when the fraud division called to confirm Jennifer's other identities, when her face appeared in mugshots across state lines, the truth gained edges sharp enough to cut denial. Weeks later, they caught her in Phoenix arrested while trying to open new bank accounts with someone else's stolen identification. Relief arrived like a tide that recedes slowly. My son, though shaken, began showing signs of something new. He moved into Mrs. Calloway's studio apartment, took a modest job at a bookstore, and started attending a support group for scam victims. Each step was small, but together they drew a map of progress. He even told me he was considering community college night classes in accounting, because he admitted with a sheepish smile, numbers don't lie the way people do. Months slipped by marked not by crises, but by dinners shared. Once a week, he insisted on cooking for me his knife skills, clumsy at first, then confident. Therapy and group meetings gave him words I had long hoped he would find: responsibility, boundaries, independence. When he toasted me one evening with a glass of red wine, calling me the strongest woman I know, I felt years of resentment soften into something like healing. He was still my son, but not the boy who had stood silent while a stranger screamed me out of my own house. He was becoming someone new, someone I could finally step back and watch without fear of collapse. Yet the story was not finished. Trials, prosecutors, and courtrooms loomed ahead, and Jennifer's shadow still reached across state lines. But Richard was learning to stand in light, and I, Margaret Watson, had remembered that age is not weakness, but a library of strength waiting to be opened. The day we were called to the prosecutor's office felt like a test of everything we had endured. Mrs. Patel, a sharp-eyed attorney with a stack of case files taller than her water bottle, laid photographs across the desk, different hairstyles, colors, and names, but all the same woman, Jennifer Stevens, or rather Jessica Simmons, as the court documents confirmed. She explained how Jessica had left a trail of shattered lives in 4 states, each victim isolated, drained, and discarded. What made Richard's case valuable, she emphasized, was the meticulous evidence I had kept: the bank statements, property deeds, and news clippings that prosecutors called a dream. I watched my son's expression shift as he listened. For years, he had mocked my filing cabinets, the way I clipped articles, or refused to switch to digital-only statements. Now those quirks were the reason a fraud network might finally collapse. "She underestimated you, Mom," he murmured, and for the first time, pride, not embarrassment, lit his eyes. The prosecutor warned us of something chilling. Notes found in Jennifer's hotel room suggested she had been planning to push Richard into marriage, a step that would have given her legal access to far more assets. My son blanched, realizing just how close he had come to disaster. I gripped his hand, both relieved and horrified, thanking fate that I had recognized the danger before it was too late. Soon after, we learned Jennifer would accept a plea deal. She would plead guilty to multiple fraud charges and cooperate against her larger network in exchange for a reduced sentence. Richard exhaled in visible relief at the thought of avoiding a long public trial. But the agreement meant we would still give victim impact statements at her sentencing. The courtroom was crowded when that day arrived. Reporters lined the benches, cameras flashed outside, and victims filled the rows. When the bailiff led her in, dressed in a plain jumpsuit with her hair pulled back, she looked smaller than the storm she had unleashed. Victims spoke one by one, their voices weaving a tapestry of loss. Then Richard stepped forward. His voice no longer carried the hesitation I had once associated with him. He spoke clearly, describing how Jennifer had not only stolen money, but tried to sever his relationship with his mother and erode his self-respect. He addressed her directly, declaring that what she intended as destruction had instead freed him. I saw her mask crack a flicker of surprise crossing her face at the strength of the man she had once manipulated so easily. When it was my turn, I stood tall. I told the judge that Jennifer's greatest mistake had been assuming age diminishes us, that a 73-year-old widow would be too fragile or too confused to fight back. I wanted the court to understand that I did not seek vengeance, only protection for other families, for other vulnerable sons and daughters. When I returned to my seat, Richard squeezed my hand with quiet reverence. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered for her victims. Afterward, as Richard and I walked into the crisp winter sunlight, I felt something profound shift inside me. I was no longer simply the woman Jennifer had tried to throw out of her house. I was the woman who had refused to be erased, who had reclaimed her son and her dignity in the process. Over the following months, our lives began to settle into new rhythms. Richard thrived at the bookstore and enrolled in night classes. He decorated his little studio with thrifted furniture and shelves of books, finding satisfaction in building a home from his own choices. For my part, I joined a hiking group, painted clumsy but joyful watercolors, and even planned a trip to the coast, a promise I had made to myself decades earlier and finally intended to keep. Slowly, the bitter memory of Jennifer's smug face gave way to fresher images: my son cooking Sunday dinner, laughter over burnt bread, the silver bracelet he later gifted me with a tiny house charm to remind us both that true homes are built on love, not lies. It was not the end, of course. Healing rarely comes neatly wrapped. There were still nights Richard wrestled with guilt, still days I had to remind myself to stop replaying her cruel words. But the path forward no longer bent toward despair. It led toward growth, toward a relationship reshaped by hard lessons and stubborn hope. Jennifer had thought she was breaking us. Instead, she had revealed what we were made of. Spring returned with a softness that felt like reward. Daffodils pushed through the soil, and on Alder Lane a for sale sign leaned proudly in front of the house that had once been the stage for my humiliation. I had decided not to rent it again. Too many echoes lingered in those rooms. Instead, I chose to sell, freeing myself from a shadowed past and opening a door toward Richard's education and my own peace of mind. The day the sign went up, Richard asked, "Are you sure about this, Mom?" I nodded. That house had served its purpose, but its season in our lives was over. Some places are better as memories, even when those memories sting. Richard was blossoming in ways I had prayed for, but never forced. He kept his modest job at the bookstore and in time was promoted to assistant manager. Nights were spent at community college studying accounting, a subject he had once thought dull, but now embraced with surprising aptitude. His support group and therapy helped him find words that built bridges instead of walls. "Real strength isn't pushing people away," he said one evening as he chopped vegetables for dinner. "It's keeping the right people close." His insight took my breath. For years he had accused me of meddling. Now he recognized that what I had offered was not control, but love tempered with experience. Life filled with small, steady joys. Weekly dinners, long conversations, and laughter that returned without force. I watched my son regain dignity piece by piece, each responsible choice adding weight to his shoulders. But this time, he bore it with pride. When he raised a glass at dinner one Saturday and toasted to fresh starts and to the strongest woman I know, I blinked away tears. He was no longer the man who stood silent while Jennifer screamed me out of my own home. He was someone new, and I too was different. For decades I had defined myself as his protector. Now I was learning to live as Margaret again, hiker, painter, traveler, someone whose life held chapters beyond motherhood. 1 year after Jennifer's departure, I sat in a community college auditorium as Richard walked across the stage to receive his accounting certificate with honors. Pride surged through me like sunlight. Afterward, at dinner with friends and neighbors, Richard leaned close and whispered, "There's a surprise after this." He drove me to Alder Lane, now alive with new owners. A firefighter, a nurse, and their 2 children tumbled happily across the lawn. "They'll make better memories here," Richard said, watching the family with a thoughtful expression. Tears pricked my eyes as I understood what he had done. He had given the house a new ending in our story, one of love rather than betrayal. That night, he handed me a velvet box containing a silver bracelet with a tiny house charm. "So we never forget," he said. I wore it with reverence, the weight light, but the meaning profound. By then, Jennifer's name had all but faded from daily conversation. But months later, Mrs. Patel called to inform me that Jennifer Jessica truly had cooperated with authorities and would be transferred to a minimum security facility. Strangely, the news no longer unsettled me. "She seems far away from us now," I told Richard when I relayed it. He agreed. In truth, she was gone in every way that mattered. That evening, he arrived with takeout, and another revelation: he had been dating a woman named Sarah, a thoughtful librarian who valued honesty. He confessed he had told her everything about Jennifer, about his failures, about the way he had once taken me for granted. Instead of recoiling, Sarah respected him more. That was how I knew he had changed. He was no longer selling illusions to himself or others. He was building something real. Our relationship settled into a balance we had never known before. I was no longer his rescuer, and he was no longer my burden. We were mother and son, yes, but also 2 people who had survived betrayal and grown stronger for it. Sometimes in quiet moments, I reflected on the irony. Jennifer had thought she was severing us, tearing mother from son. Instead, she had welded us together with bonds forged in fire. Her greatest cruelty had become the spark of our greatest transformation. And while she served her years behind bars, Richard and I finally began living ours fully, gratefully, and freely. 2 years after Jennifer first screamed me out of the house on Alder Lane, I found myself sitting in the garden of Richard and Sarah's new home. The dogwood tree was in bloom, soft white petals drifting like confetti across a stone bench, inscribed with words that made my breath catch. For Margaret Watson, who taught us that true strength comes from within. It was their wedding gift to me, a quiet promise that I would always have a place in their lives. Sarah stood beside Richard, her eyes warm, her hand resting on his arm, and for the first time, I understood what it meant for my son to love and be loved without illusion. The ceremony that followed was simple, filled with vows they had written themselves. When the officiant asked who presented Richard in marriage, he lifted his chin and answered, "I present myself with gratitude to my mother who taught me to stand on my own." My heart swelled so deeply, I thought it might burst. The reception shimmered with joy. Guests laughed under strings of lights, music swirled, and Richard led me onto the dance floor for the traditional mother-son dance. "Happy?" I asked him as we swayed. Beyond words, he replied, his voice steady. He admitted he had thought of Jennifer that morning, not with longing, but with clarity. "She pushed me to my breaking point," he said. "But maybe she gave me the greatest gift. Without her, I might never have changed." I told him the strength had always been there. It had simply taken the right storm to draw it out. Later, before he and Sarah left for their honeymoon, Richard pressed a small key into my hand. "To our house," he explained softly. "You'll always be welcome. No one will ever tell you to leave again." I closed my fingers around it, the symbolic weight greater than gold. Life moved forward with grace. Richard thrived in his new career at an accounting firm, fully independent for the first time. Sarah proved as kind and thoughtful as she was intelligent, and together they built a home filled with warmth. I continued hiking, painting, and even took that long dreamed-of trip to the coast, walking barefoot along the shoreline, with the wind in my hair, finally living not just as someone's mother, but as Margaret, a woman of consequence and choice. And yet, each time I glanced at the bracelet Richard had given me, the little house charm glinting in the light, I remembered the lesson our journey had carved deep into me. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are doorways to unexpected beginnings. Jennifer had underestimated me, mistaking age for weakness, wisdom for meddling, love for control. She thought she could strip me of dignity, property, and family with a few cruel words. Instead, she became the catalyst for a transformation neither Richard nor I had dared hope for. She lost not because of courts or prison sentences, but because she could not break what mattered most. She could not destroy the bond between a mother and her son once it was reforged in truth. So here is what I have learned. What I want anyone listening to remember: never underestimate the quiet strength of those you dismiss. A house can be taken, money can be stolen, reputations can be smeared, but resilience, memory, and love endure. At 75, I stand taller than I ever have, not because life spared me hardship, but because it did not. It tested me, and I walked through. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what lessons life has taught you about strength and second chances. Your stories matter too.